A fiercely divided Egypt as supporters have ousted Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi vow to remain in the streets until the Islamist leader is returned to office. But opponents have also dug in and are calling for more mass rallies like the ones that led to Morsi's removal by the powerful military. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Brett Hume, Fox News senior political analyst, Nina Easton of Fortune magazine, former Democratic Congressman Dennis Kucinich, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Good morning to you all.
Good morning. Good morning.
Let me throw a jump ball out there. How does this all turn out? Is this going to embolden the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic militants?
Well, I don't think we have any way of knowing right now. This is completely up in the air, as a jump ball would suggest. And I would say that the question for Americans is whether this administration's policy is designed to bring about the desired outcome, which would be a kind of a peaceful and stable Egypt on the path to democracy. You know, the president said the other day, John, that speaking of this military coup, and that's what it was, that this is part of the quote, transition to democracy. When the military throws an elected leader out of office and takes charge of the government and begins locking up the leaders of the previous government and its adherents, that's a very peculiar way to describe it, to call it part of a transition to democracy. So and let's suppose, for example, we ended up with Mohammed el-Baradei. Now, people are speaking in glowing terms of him.
That's not going to happen.
No, it looks like it's not as final as it looked yesterday. But here's a man who has been no great friend of the United States. When he was head of the UN Weapons Agency, he gave us fits in the effort to deter Iran from its nuclear program, just to cite one example. He's a kind of international bureaucrat that some people love. But so there are a lot of bad outcomes here. And it's not at all clear to me we can get to a good one, but we need to figure out as a nation and as an administration what's really going on over there.
Yeah, how do you think the president's been handling this?
Well, he's been handling it by saying we're not taking sides, and perhaps we should be asking the question, should you be taking the side of democracy? Yes, Morsi was inept. Yes, he was not an inclusive. He had a lot of authoritarian tendencies. But to turn to the army, which is what happened in Egypt, and which this administration stood by and let happen, what the army takes, it can give away. So it can depose the next government if there's popular uprising after that. And that's likely going to happen. This is a country with a dysfunctional economy, all sorts of problems, corruption, and doesn't have a history of civil liberties, and which, by the way, the Army reflects that behavior as well.
I'll give folks a little glimpse behind the curtain. Every Saturday we have a call with the panelists. We talk about these topics, and Dennis Kucinich, you had an interesting theory about what might have happened here based on the prevalence of Egyptian military in the building right behind me on Capitol Hill.
Through 16 years in Congress, the only military which consistently visited my office, and I would say I didn't have a special privilege, or all over Capitol Hill, the Egyptian military. Now, why do they do that? Because the Egyptian military gets more than 70% of the U.S., of this budget comes from U.S. taxpayers. So we have an enormous influence on what the Egyptian military does. And to pretend that the White House is staying aloof from this doesn't pass the straight face test, frankly. So we have to understand that we are playing a role here, that there was a military coup, that the military is getting backed financially by the U.S., and unless, as Senator John McCain said, that we pull that aid, we will have been instrumental in helping not just this coup, but as Nina implies, perhaps the next one. We cannot tell Islamists that we want them to pursue democratic traditions if, in fact, when a democratically elected government who happens to believe in Islam is suddenly dislodged in a coup by a military which is strongly backed by the United States.
So, Juan, should we pull our aid from Egypt's military?
No, I think that would be self-defeating. Obviously, we want to exercise the leverage we have there. The reason that we give the Egyptians so much military aid is, in fact, because it's in our national interest. It's in our national interest in terms of looking at that region, looking at Israel, trying to hold off what's taking place in Syria, what's taking place in Iran. Absolutely, it's the case that Egypt is an important ally to the United States. That's why we need it to be stable. But let's not, have any illusions here. while Britt may think that el-Baradei is no friend to the United States, the Islamists in Egypt see him as a secularist, a guy who spent most of his time in the West, in New York and London, and they fear him. That's why yesterday they said they'd pull out of any coalition if el-Baradei was part of it. So from our perspective, the U.S. perspective, el-Baradei is better than having some of these Islamists take power again. I think, you know, the problem for the Islamists is they haven't demonstrated the capacity to govern. And I think that's what the Egyptian people said.
But neither have any of these opposition
yeah.
parties either, because they're so horribly organized they couldn't get it together.
One,
in
the
last
only
election.
institution that has the ability to govern there is the army, which is hugely popular, and that's the institution that's been in power, and that's the institution that the public has turned to guide a democracy, which is probably not the direction you want to go if you really want a democracy. And if you're not going to use military aid as leverage to move a country towards a democracy, an inclusive democracy, what do you get? You're just not going to have any leverage? You're not going to use your leverage?
That's what I'm saying. I think we have to use our leverage, and that's why I say I don't have the kind of inhibitions that I'm hearing from some of you about saying to the military, here is what's in the U.S. interest. We, as Congressman Kucinich said, we put money in there, and we put it in for a very real reason, which is that we want influence. It's time to exercise it. We've got a new team in place at the White House with Rice, Hagel, and Kerry. And they are trying right now. They tried to get Morsi to make a deal to be more compromising. He refused. Don't mistake it. He's not a good guy.
Look, whether you should make the decision to cut off aid now or to keep it going is really two sides of the same coin. It is a way of exercising the influence that the aid provides. Something we apparently have failed to do during Morsi's reign, and believe me, Morsi and his government and military were just as dependent on the aid as any current or future government will be. So, and remember that a lot of that aid has to do with the treaty, particularly the treaty with Israel, which was a milestone, and very critical in the Middle East, and has definitely helped. So if we're going to cut off aid, we've got to be careful about how we do it, which aid we cut off, and so on. But it seems to me that it's the right call to try to use the leverage one way or the other to try to bring about to get the country actually on a path to democracy.
Let me jump in here because let's leave, obviously, further discussion on this. Let's leave that for Panel Plus coming up after the show.